Welcome, everyone. I'm Zsolt, Director of Virtual ASN and a Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University in Canada. I've been looking forward to this event for a very long time, to host an interdisciplinary virtual ASN conversation on the future of democracy after Viktor Orbán. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Each of you brings deep expertise and insight into Hungary's political, institutional, social, international dimensions. Of course, the April 12th elections are enormously significant for Hungary itself, but they also raise broader questions for Europe, for democracy, for the United States, for autocrats, for would-be autocrats, and perhaps most importantly for ordinary people living under authoritarian systems who are looking for ways, for examples for what they can do to resist autocracy or re-democratize. And one reason this conversation matters so much is that Hungary has long been treated as a case study in autocratization, and today many people around the world are asking whether it can also become an example for re-democratization. I'm especially grateful that this panel brings together perspectives across different fields of expertise, because addressing questions about what it actually took for Hungarians to vote the Orbán regime out of power and what conditions made it possible, which lessons travel beyond Hungary, which do not, what challenges begin after the landslide electoral victory. All of these questions can be addressed exactly through this kind of conversation. And so thank you again for being here. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Before giving our panelists the virtual floor, I'd like to briefly remind everyone of the format, the script that we usually follow in our seminars. In the first part, each invited expert will offer a brief commentary and analysis from their perspective. And after these presentations, we'll move to an interactive discussion where panelists respond to audience questions and may also engage with one another's points. The short biographies will be posted in chat, so I won't read them aloud because we'd like to leave as much time as possible for discussion. We use chat for posting panelist bios and also for sharing some relevant literature sources as they come up during the discussion. So I'd like to suggest that to our panelists. If there's anything you'd like to recommend, feel free to post links, suggestions in chat along the way. And the Q&A box is for audience questions. So for our audience members, please use that rather than chat. Please feel free to type in your questions at any point in the Q&A box during the presentations and afterward when we begin the interactive portion of the event. And now I'd like to invite Zsolt Enyedi, political science professor at Central European University, who is also the lead researcher of the De- and Re-Democratization Research Group at CEU's Democracy Institute, a group that has been focused directly at the questions in focus today. Zsolt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Zsuzsa, for this great opportunity. And thanks a lot to the Hungarian voters. So, as I think all of you know, Fidesz has arrived to this election with an enormous advantage. Advantage in terms of financial resources, advantage in terms of media access, in terms of institutional identification with the state. By 2026, I think for many Hungarian citizens, Fidesz was identical with the Hungarian state, and that obviously meant an enormous advantage. So the question is, how could Fidesz be defeated given this very asymmetric distribution of resources? I will present a couple of reasons, and I'm sure my colleagues will complement them, because you can come up with others as well. But let me just focus on the ones that I consider the most important ones. So to me, maybe number one or number two reason is economic stagnation. Hungary hasn't had economic growth since at least 2022. And this economic stagnation was coupled with a kind of spectacular enrichment of the Fidesz elite. Fidesz elite has, grown very rich out of corruption already earlier as well, but the combination of these two factors proved to be extremely irritating for most voters. Then the second factor is the concentration of the opposition vote on one alternative. The Hungarian electoral system is very disproportional. The fragmented opposition has been penalized in the past because of this nature of the electoral system. The opposition parties try to come up with various solutions for this, building various alliances, but those alliances did not function properly. And now we have one actor emerging and taking over the entire opposition scene. The minor opposition parties either withdrew or disbanded, or were just simply marginalized. Now, of course, why Magyar could emerge, Peter Magyar and his party TISA, as such a powerful alternative? Well, that has a lot to do with his personal skills, his strategy, and the circumstances in which he emerged. He appeared in 2024 in the middle of a major moral scandal. Fidesz was busy conducting a homophobic campaign that had a slogan, "Don't touch our kids." And then it turned out that Fidesz top leaders were involved in pardoning someone who assisted a pedophile predator. So this moral scandal helped Magyar to rise. He came out as a whistleblower, but then he became a fast professional politician, very hardworking one. He visited hundreds of small towns across the last 2 years. So he was constantly on a journey across the country, trying to balance out the fact that Fidesz used to be able to collect the vote from the countryside, from rural areas, much more efficiently than the opposition parties. So he went to those regions where Fidesz was very strong and was able to woo some of Fidesz voters with his kind of patriotic center-right rhetoric, but more importantly with his focus on healthcare, education, transportation, and other bread and butter issues. He also had a very disciplined campaign, energizing the youth, who made a big difference at the end. And he was able to work out tacit cooperation with the left-wing, progressive, liberal forces. For example, when the mayor of Budapest organized a Pride parade, he stayed out of it, but made clear that under his rule, demonstrations would be allowed for everyone. Then another factor that made a big difference, I think, is the completely out-of-touch, far-fetched campaign of the government party, which stems from the fact partly that Orbán could not campaign on domestic achievements because there were not many, and because he was not anymore interested in Hungarian domestic affairs. He became a global player. He wanted to speak about global issues, and he focused almost exclusively in the campaign on Ukraine, which was not something that Hungarians were particularly interested in. Then another factor was the growth of very innovative independent media that provided a platform for Magyar, since opposition media, independent media could not count on the state and on commercial advertisements. They had to come up with something new. So they came up with various mechanisms of crowdfunding and they became extremely influential. At the very same time, Fidesz lost part of its media because they were particularly active in terms of Google and Meta ads. Fidesz was the party across whole Europe that put most money into this kind of advertising, but these companies stopped working with the political ads. They decided, because they couldn't comply with EU regulation, to stop this kind of ads. So Fidesz was not able to replace those ads with some kind of organic social media strategy, because, well, they were not used to doing anything organically by 2026. Another major issue was that Fidesz was not able to keep a right balance between Euroscepticism and getting EU funding. They were quite good at that earlier, but by 2026, the rift between the EU and Fidesz became very large, and this became very spectacular when EU stopped financing Hungary, froze the various funds, and Hungarian universities, many of them were excluded from European grants. So basically, Hungarians understood that a vote for Fidesz could be easily a vote for leaving EU. Then another issue was that Fidesz was unable to keep a right balance between intimidation and formal democracy. They tried to intimidate the public in various ways, but they stopped short of using actual violence, and in a way showed themselves to be weak. They were not able to ban the Pride, for example. Then another issue was the extremely weak feedback mechanisms around Orbán. So the fact that they were not able to calibrate their strategy has a lot to do with the fact that they were not able to measure public opinion appropriately. And then something they didn't count with, and this is that in the last moments of the campaign, some civil servants came out and spoke against the partisanship of civil service and how they are forced to work for one party against the opposition. Also, Fidesz was unable to find any way to communicate with the younger generations. It was just simply too conservative for the youth, and especially was unable to reframe these pedophilia scandals that hurt the party very much. Interestingly, the support of Trump and J.D. Vance and Putin probably hurt Fidesz further, because Fidesz used to play the card of being the David against the Goliath. And obviously, when everybody supports you from the Kremlin to the White House, it's a bit difficult to do that. Also, Orbán made a terrible mistake by taking the international illiberal project too seriously. And as part of this international illiberal project, he not only supported Trump, but he also supported the extreme right in Romania. He supported Fico, the nationalist leader of Slovakia, and that was not in line with even center-right sentiments in Hungary. And the activists, the civil society activists and the opposition activists were particularly skillful this time to monitor the electoral process, and they were able to stop, in some cases, vote buying and intimidation. Finally, there were some factors that were not under his control. I mean, the passage of time is one of those. So simply people got tired of Orbán after 16 years, as, by the way, Orbán got tired of Hungarians by the end of his reign. So he was really focusing on international affairs. And there were some minor miscalculations, like investing in Asian capital, like building this battering plants that didn't turn out to be particularly profitable, but turned out to be extremely polluting, so undermining his support on an unexpected front. To conclude, there were many mistakes on Orbán's side, but that he built was not something that could easily survive in European Union in an environment that expects some degree, some minimum of human rights to be expected. And he did not prepare for someone coming from his own ranks, partly because he underestimated Magyar as somebody who was an underling in his own regime, and didn't expect someone to come with this kind of bit populistic, bit nationalistic, but at the same time pro-liberal democracy discourse. And given the calibration of the system, so the regime was basically prepared how to fight the left, how to fight liberals, but not how to fight this kind of challenge. And because the regime ran out of resources, something that I'm sure Gábor will speak more about, by 2026 there was very little he could innovate, and he was not willing to change, which also shows that he got out of touch. The whole regime was built on the idea that Fidesz can be defeated, but not with two-thirds majority. Because had Fidesz been defeated by a simple majority, there was enough resources put aside, enough national authorities from the president to constitutional court to many other agencies that would have supported Fidesz even in opposition and would have eased the return to power. But because TISA won with two-thirds majority, constitutional majority, virtually none of these structures and mechanisms that Orbán built are of any use at this stage. So probably we are really witnessing not only a regime change, not only quasi-revolutionary alternation of the Hungarian political system, but also the demise of Fidesz itself. Zsuzsa?
Thank you. Thank you, Zsolt. Can you guys hear me? I have a little bit of okay. So my internet access seems to be a little bit unstable, but I'd like to ask Gábor Scheiring to pick up the thread from here, and Zsolt has already provided a few prompters about things that we are hoping Gábor is going to address, including some of the economic aspects of the Orbán regime and what needs to be deconstructed in order for the regime change to actually happen. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know if it's possible to share a presentation. If not, I will just describe whatever I have.
Lucine, are you allowing it? Are you allowing Gábor to share his?
Yes, I just granted access. Gábor,
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Perfect. So thank you very much. This is indeed, in many ways, an unusual opportunity. We have gotten used to so much to talking about Hungary in negative ways, but now here we are talking about the future of democracy and the hopes that we all have about restoring sanity and some sense of professionalism in Hungarian politics. So this is really something new. But perhaps my impression is that you have encountered many takes on how this is a historical opportunity, and I fully agree with those. But what I think is missing a little bit is more of a bird's eye view look at not just the short-term tasks, but the long-term challenges lying on the road towards what I would call sustainable democratization. So first, I want to reflect on what actually happened, just following up on what Zsolt was saying. And then I want to spend the second part of these 10 minutes looking at this triple trap towards sustainable democratization. So first, I think it's really important to see that the defeat of Viktor Orbán's regime is not yet the ultimate victory of liberal democracy. And for that, I think really it's a good starting point to understand what Zsolt was already arguing, that perhaps the most important factor that allowed the regime to collapse was the exhaustion of its economic model. What I would add to Zsolt is that it was a model that exhausted, a particular kind of nationalist twist on a dependent economic model that relies on foreign capital, initially German, later on East Asian capital, using Hungarian cheap labor, working in assembly plants, to put together whatever innovation is happening in China, Korea, or Germany, and then export it back to the world. And then the role locally is, in a very simplistic way, you can either do the cleaning services, provide some legal services, and then cheap labor. And this does not really allow Hungary to get out of this middle income trap and contributed to the lack of ability of the economy to capture and distribute value locally. And Orbán promised to fix this when he was elected. Indeed, the same kind of economic model got into crisis already during the 2000s, the same kind of dependent model. What Orbán did was a kind of economic nationalist half-turn, plus throwing a lot of money at his cronies, and that didn't really help. He lacked a proper kind of vision about developmental state and industrial policy, and that was his undoing at the end of the day. I would add another thing to the opposition, which is, as Zsolt was very well saying, was not able to live up to the challenge created by Viktor Orbán's electoral law. And I see this challenge as a dilemma or a trap between innovation and unity. So as I was mentioning, the pre-2010 era kind of third Hungarian republic, as we call it, with its economic inequalities and stagnating real wages, wasn't particularly popular by the end of the 2000s. And the political elites associated with that era were not particularly popular either. So there was a deep desire among Hungarian society to see a new opposition, or at least some form of true political innovation. But for that, we'd need older and newer parties to compete on the opposition side. But if you compete, you lack unity. However, if you unite, it means you're freezing the opposition the way it is. And that is very easy for Orbán to campaign against with as long as the opposition has no new political identity and offer. So that's one thing that really the opposition never managed to get out of this trap. And the second is that there was very often a lot of talk about protecting democracy and trying to protect democracy by talking about democracy. And by all means, I truly think that rule of law and freedom of speech and all these things are deeply important, but to create a majoritarian electoral coalition, you need to bring democracy close to people. So to speak, you defend democracy by protecting people against economic and political power. And this is something that the old opposition never managed to really do. And just to give you one example, there was a really hopeful mass movement against the modification of the labor code, also known as the slave law, which created a large unified coalition based on a social labor issue. But then as it went ahead and an increasing number of leading opposition figures joined, it kind of evolved into a movement against or for freedom of speech. And at that point, it kind of petered out as well. And what Peter Magyar managed to do is kind of get out of this innovation versus unity dilemma by just bulldozing off the old opposition. All other opposition parties dissolved themselves, those two who did not face really accumulating defeat. And he also innovated in many ways politically, including talking a lot about public services, the dignity of work, health, education. These are the things that were really critically important for the majority of Hungarians. So I think that's really a new innovation. And he clearly was someone who was not associated with the old opposition like myself. So this is really a historic breakthrough, but it also has a ceiling. And I think it's really important to recognize this because there is a sense of magical thinking that we could go back to the 90s kind of liberal democracy, but I think it is in crisis globally. And we need new models. We need a kind of democracy 2.0 to make liberal democracy sustainable. And there are a few examples that show that these kinds of centrist restorations fail, like Starmer in Britain, post-Magyar Slovakia, 2011 Tunisia. They're different cases, but they are all linked to a kind of project that failed to address the underlying economic, political, cultural challenges that drive illiberal autocratic forces. So what are these three challenges? First, there is the economic trap. As I mentioned, Hungary as a peripheral assembly platform without the developmental state model, fueling cheap, low wages and lack of innovation. These cannot be fixed by just bringing in EU funds, which will be critically important to boost the economy in the short run. And I hope that Peter Magyar will be able to do that. But there's a need for a new economic model, for a new kind of industrial policy, green industrial policy to steer the market towards a more future-proof economic model that creates more value added domestically. And for that, you need a transformative agenda. And I don't see that at the moment taking place or taking root. But of course, the new government has some time to think this through and come up with strategies. The second is a political trap. And again, I have hoped that Peter Magyar will be able to eradicate what I call the extra-governmental fortifications of illiberalism, these quasi-private foundations, loyal business networks, partisan institutions, and his qualified supermajority is really critical for that. As Zsolt was saying, Fidesz and Orbán was not really prepared for this scenario that another party would have a two-thirds qualified majority that will allow them to undo these extra governmental fortifications. So that is critically important. However, this is not equal to opening democracy to citizens. And Peter Magyar is currently integrating Hungarians through this influencer celebrity politics style, which creates a lot of symbolic capital, but can turn into a bubble without deep institutional roots. TISA party has around 30 members. Unions are weak. Mass membership-based civil society is also particularly strong. So you need to strengthen this grassroots social capital and mass-based organizations to create a social foundation and power in society that can control economic and political elites. And the third is a culture trap. And here again, I have hopes. And the inauguration ceremony showed a kind of inclusive nationalist agenda. For the first time, the Roma anthem was being sung in the parliament. The EU flag is back at the top of the Hungarian parliament building. But there's also a lot of talk about against immigration. And the majority of Hungarians work in low-end service sectors and production. So those around 60%, their main channel of integrating into politics is nationalism. And Peter Magyar seems to continue that kind of nationalist in political integration as a strategy. But we know that the far right is always better at nationalism than the center right. So in the long run, that could legitimize far right strategies without an inclusive cultural identity. So to conclude, towards sustainable democratization, this triple trap is real, but not insurmountable. And you need a kind of transformative developmental state model and multiple electoral cycles. Peter Magyar and his government has time to do this. They have significant political capital, but I think you would also need eventually some kind of progressive input to kind of make democracy really sustainable. And if I may close with this, for the first time since the First World War, there is no left of center party represented in the Hungarian parliament. So this is okay for now if the goal is the first step is to restore liberal democracy, but the addressing this triple trap, economic insecurity, cultural devaluation, political alienation, will require going beyond the 90s style liberal model, and that will require creative, transformative thinking. All right, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gábor. And you've done exactly what we were hoping for. You were raising big questions that have not really been addressed a lot in our discussions. And I guess the link toward what I'm hoping Márta Pardavi will be addressing is what you said about how democracy needs to be brought close to people. Your emphasis was on socio-economic empowerment, recognition of the peripheries, working class, dealing with the abandoned program of the left. But there was also this other aspect of direct democracy that was, in my mind, one of the most amazing achievements of this TISA movement. The civil society organizations, the civic, really bottom-up organizations. And in that sphere, Márta Pardavi, I think, has been one of the most consistent voices and very, very courageous civic actors upholding the ceiling for human rights and the rights of the vulnerable little people. And I'm going to give it over to Márta.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsa, and thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be a practitioner in this academic setting, and I really enjoyed the two previous speakers, and I hope to focus a little bit more on actually civil society, as you already mentioned. But I also want to thank all of you and people in the audience too, because yes, I think Hungarians did it, but you need support for this, both domestically, but also the constant and unrelenting international attention and support to what's going on in Hungary, I think has been quite important. And yes, I think as you mentioned, Gábor, the outcome of this elections really reflects something very deep, a deeper change than just simply about a political fortune or political reversal. And it speaks about the resilience of Hungarian society, something that was perhaps less visible, but very, very important. The resilience of voters, citizens, the independent media organizations and their innovation and absolute dogged resoluteness in uncovering corruption, the civil society organizations who've been, like my own organization, giving legal support to journalists, to citizens, to the whistleblowers, to many of the actors who've actually helped push the corruption exposure to an unavoidable level. So we have kept, I think, democratic norms visible even under sustained pressure. And what we're witnessing today, these weeks, actually just a month ago, right, was when the election happened, is not a sudden rupture, but the result of more than well over a decade of persistent civic effort in what was an increasingly restrictive environment. And for those of us who have lived and worked through this period, this moment is particularly extraordinary. And in a very real sense, we've been nurturing in I guess, a microscopic form, the resilience that now has become visible at scale. Civil society organizations and informal citizen groups, including the TISA Islands, which accompany the party, and independent journalists have really sustained spaces for both accountability and resistance, pluralism, debate, even as these spaces were gradually squeezed. And this election result is perhaps also a political expression of that long-term work. But we know very well, exactly as Gábor, you pointed out, that democratic renewal is built over time. It's very often built quietly by actors who insist on maintaining standards when doing this is neither easy nor rewarded. And indeed, what we witnessed and experienced ourselves was that very often this type of authoritarianism or autocratization doesn't really need to rely on the usual go-to notions of repression, the widespread physical violence or the overt intimidation. These are not necessarily for it to become effective. And the hybrid regime model that emerged in Hungary over the past decade was not really defined primarily by overt repression, but instead it was the kind of slower, more incremental logic, steady erosion of autonomy across key sectors, the media, civil society, academia, the arts and cultural life, and of course also the economy, where economic actors also were very clearly losing their autonomy. And there was such a high level of interference in the economy that really distorted a sort of fair play, and it will be, I have to say, very, very difficult to reinstate. So this process was gradual, often very technical. It rarely generated the high-level political attention that would go beyond the concerns about corruption. And these deeper structural transformations were less visible. And this, particularly the hard-to-grasp chilling effect, which was one of the go-to mechanisms, I think was particularly pervasive. And this is what we saw sort of a de-icing of this was happening, I think, in the last few months of the campaign, particularly as the election campaign became increasingly absurd, intimidating. We also saw a lot of people speak up, and there was a very clear resistance. The harder the push, perhaps the stronger the resilience and the resistance. And so for us, you know, a lot of people who have been feeling not only joy, but anger and pain after the many years of harassment and smear campaigns that have been going on, the job losses, the menacing laws, and the emotional stress, to hear that Péter Magyar, as a new prime minister, apologized in his inaugural speech in Parliament was, I think, quite something. And this is, I think, a moment where we can really perhaps put our finger on a shift, a pivot. He said, and I'll quote here, "I apologize to all those individuals from civil society, teachers, journalists, health workers, and public figures who've been stigmatized, harassed, or treated as enemies for daring to speak out, for daring to stand up for the vulnerable, for criticizing, or for simply expressing a different opinion." He said, "I apologize." And so this was a really important moment. And the question is, so what do we have that will build on this apology? Where is this going to take us? And obviously, the incoming government has a very clear stated ambition to dismantle institutional distortions and to rebuild a democratic constitutional order. This is both necessary and very welcome. But the question will be how this will unfold, and to what extent will this really encompass and invite all members of society. And so the role of civil society becomes really, really crucial. Again, both the organized and the unorganized civil society groups, I think, will have a crucial, central role to play in rebuilding or democratizing. We have a momentum now, a very clearly energized public. There's never been, I think, so much interest in politics, in public life, since the 1989-1990 period as now. So everywhere you go in the street, you hear people saying things like constitutionalism. And there is such a high interest, but how do we turn this into genuine, sustainable, as Gábor also pointed out, sustainable demand for not only the nice notion of democracy, but for democratic practices. And so this will entail also quite a big shift for civil society organizations too. Those that are organized, those that have been quite resisting and describing the autocratization process and also assisting the victims of this. I think there is a huge challenge for us also to make a pretty rapid shift. If the past decade was perhaps defined by resistance, the coming period will require a shift towards sustained oversight and engagement and accountability. And the conversations that were perhaps once confined to more expert circles will now need to widen and hopefully keep on being present in everyday discourse in Hungary. And this heightened level of engagement is, I think, the resource we can build on, but it won't sustain itself automatically, and it will require very deliberate effort, investment, organizational capacity. So the question is, how do we make this shift beyond the determination? This requires a new strategy, a new set of resources, an enabling environment that needs to build up. And there's quite a lot, I think, domestically that is available already in Hungarian legislation, in practices that we can build on and sort of draw back. But also, of course, there is a European Union context and a Council of Europe context. And perhaps it's quite striking to me that I'm the one who starts focusing on this. And it is, I think, because we had to realize that the EU framework can be very effective in very narrow issues once the political will is accompanying it, but it won't be able to really impose externally a shift without citizen participation. And so I think we have now seen a process, transformation where the European Union's policies and legal actions, particularly the freezing of EU funds, which is quite important these days in Hungary, were complementary to the processes in Hungary. And the question is, going forward, how will these processes, laws, standards, policies be able to support a democratic renewal in Hungary? And will they be able to engage and support citizen engagement? And I have to say, we have to be quite realistic that although we talk a lot about bringing home the frozen EU funds, but these tools, these milestones, the criteria that once met, they would unlock the frozen EU funds, they don't really cover many key aspects of a healthy and vibrant democracy or an enabling environment for media and civil society. So they have a fairly narrow focus on anti-corruption and good governance and judicial independence and some, but they don't cover the entire spectrum of problems. And so we have some cases from the Court of Justice of the European Union or from the European Court of Human Rights. We have some standards from constitutional experts like the Venice Commission. We also have some policy instruments like the new European Civil Society Strategy that came out from the European Commission last year. We also have partnership principle in EU funding programs that requires the participation of civil society in implementing and monitoring the use of EU funds. But this is not going to be strong enough to sustain this change. And so Hungarian organizations coming together in a 50-plus member coalition called Civilizáció, which for a very long time had the purpose of actually pushing back against this shrinking civic space phenomenon. Now we've put together a set of recommendations, sort of a minimum package addressing the Hungarian government and also Hungarian society on how to create a more enabling environment that is going to be a platform, a basis for this continued civil society engagement. And this ranges from sort of immediate measures that are necessary but not sufficient to grow democracy at a grassroots level to something which is quite strategic and would require long-term. And so these are quite distinct, but I really wonder where they will feature in the government's political agenda, how which ministry, which state secretary, how much funding will be allocated to these tasks. And I think that very often these are overlooked because it's civil society and is generally overlooked, but the role that we have crafted in this political transformation until the elections, I think had really highlighted how key citizen engagement could be. And people in Hungary now really, I truly believe, have a closer connection to this than even 2 years ago. And so there's a lot to build on. And the big question that remains is, how are we going to be able to sustain this? What policy measures will be put in place? What legal frameworks to ensure that there is genuine citizen participation, perhaps direct democracy, innovative democratic practices, also public consultation processes, freedom of information, open government opportunities. These will all be very good indicators of how this new Hungarian government is truly committed to this democratic renewal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Márta. I like the way everyone is focusing on not just short-term democratization and renewal, but sustainable democratic renewal, and the way you went from civil society and the engagement of actors, ordinary people, to the need for a regional, European and regional enabling environment. And so that actually leads really nicely into what I'm hoping Erin, Jenne will come on and focus on. I'd like to mention that I really like Erin's concept of nested security, the title of her second book, and in which she talks about the complexity of all of this in order to build. Her focus is more on interethnic relations and to build an inclusive way of dealing with them in a framework that she calls nested security. And I was just thinking that democracy and re-democratization needs that as well, obviously. And so it's a very complex and extremely difficult task. But there are some hopeful lessons, I think, from Hungarians, from what happened in the last 2 years, a lot of which, as Márta mentioned, emphasized, was not visible from abroad. So what was visible was the election, the polls just immediately prior to the election, but all the work that had gone into it before that was less visible. But anyway, so Erin, floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsuzsa, also for plugging my second book. That's always appreciated. Actually, that's a perfect segue into how I wanted to open my comments, which is to plug actually another piece that I've written, which was published in Comparative European Politics in 2021. It's called Populist Argumentation in Foreign Policy, the Case of Hungary under Viktor Orbán 2010 to 2020, which I co-authored with Peter Vishnevitz. And the aim here was to try to take stock of what had happened under the Orbán regime, and particularly how radically foreign policy had changed, which is notable in an EU country where you would think that major foreign policy change is importantly constrained by the EU. So the important thing that we were trying to do was to, de-link this understanding that populism leads to specific policies and instead focus on populism as a kind of style of governance, which is also an approach that's been taken by Sandra Destrade and Johan Plegeman, which is to say that there are certain characteristic features of populist governments, of which Orbán was one. And one is this personalization of the foreign ministry, which we can see how they got rid of these career diplomats. He put Szijjártó in place of Martonyi, who was a career diplomat who's actually part of his first government in 1998 to 2002. And they really just swept out all of these kind of diplomats and ambassadors who are seen as too they were seen as too pro-values and not enough pro-interest and not committed enough to Hungarian sovereignty. So this is one feature of what Orbán did to foreign policy, which is to actually change the machinery of diplomacy to personalize it and make it kind of more his political tool. To de-bureaucratize it, which of course obviously has parallels in the democratic realm. And then, what do you do with these, with this sort of more nimble, kind of more discretionary tool of foreign policy? You make major changes, in the country's foreign policy orientation. Here, this consists of two things: breaking from traditional allies, the first thing, and seeking out non-traditional partnerships. And if you think about this in the kind of perspective of international relations, this is very similar to what's known as hedging. Right, which is to say, we don't feel ourselves to be protected or our interests properly represented in the current kind of alliances that we have, namely the EU, namely the US, what they consider to be values-based interests rather than sovereign interests, and instead kind of branch out to hedge by seeking out these non-traditional partnerships. And we can see this in populist governments everywhere, right? Including the current Trump administration. So fast forwarding to the Magyar government. So there's a range of things that are changing, but then I think a number of them that are likely to remain the same. And part of this is a feature of this kind of hedging sort of strategy, again, which is something that countries do that are sandwiched between rivals, right? Here, this would be sort of the Western sort of NATO alliance versus obviously Russia. But you could think also further afield to China, and that maps very much onto Orbán's keleti nyitás, the opening to the east. Right, so what Magyar stated is really kind of a return to Martonyi's triad of priorities. First of all, EU and NATO realignment, reattached to the Western side. Secondly, good neighbor relations. So this is kind of always sort of been a principle, but sort of not really prioritized so much under the Orbán government as compared to sovereignty. And the third thing is help for Hungarians abroad. And I think that, so what we see then is a shift in the first thing, right? The alignment, right? Going back to a kind of an earlier period of of Hungarian foreign policy, trying to reestablish good neighbor relations, but also maintaining support for Hungarians abroad, which has always been a priority for all Hungarian governments, right? Related to the first point, the new foreign minister Orbán said that Hungary must stop being a stick in the spokes and start being a spoke in the wheel, right? Hungary has to stop being a veto player. It has to start being a better Western ally. So, and the success, obviously, of the new government, what it's banking on is its ability to unlock 17 billion euros in EU structural funds by showing that they're this good ally. So this is probably the clearest kind of change that we're likely to see in foreign policy, as the Hungarian government also had been blocking massive amounts of loans to Kiev. So, the other thing that, of course, comes up in thinking about the new Magyar foreign policy is the subject of Ukraine and Russia. And here, I think you're likely to see a lot less change, like some change in some areas, but less change in others. Right. So obviously, the Magyar government has committed to striking a new stance on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. They're less opposed than the previous government to Ukrainian EU accession, but they insist on imposing conditionality. So that's a kind of like it's not 100%, yes, we need to get Ukraine in EU, but they have to stand in line like everybody else. Also, they've ruled out sending arms to Ukraine, but on the other hand, have promised not to act as a veto player. The new government is also committed to continued access to Russian gas and oil. So 80% of Hungarian oil imports come from Russia. And the Hungarian government also has this long-term, multi-decade lease on, technological assistance with the Paks-2 nuclear plant. So all of these things link Russia and Hungary together kind of in perpetuity, although, of course, they're talking about reviewing these contracts that they've done with Russia. And there has been a pivot to diversify sources of gas. At the same time, the government has also, speaking again about Ukraine, signaled its strong concern with the rights of the Transcarpathian Hungarian minority in Ukraine. So this aligns with its commitment to continue supporting Hungarians abroad. Okay. And then turning to the US and transatlantic relations more broadly, this again is a bit of a mix. I think there's maybe less change that we're likely to see here. Now, this relationship is actually something that Orbán kind of bragged quite extensively about because, obviously the strongman relationship that he supposedly had with Trump was seen as a benefit to the Hungarian government, where they could strike bilateral deals with Washington, leapfrogging over EU relations, right? And this is absolutely unorthodox, clearly, how they were trying to deal with the tariffs that were put into place in April of 2025, the famous Trump tariffs. And Hungary kind of decided that, they can try to get a deal with Trump. And indeed, they did get a 1-year sort of exemption on sanctions on Russian gas, which helped them obviously economically. But at the same time, there was pressure, there has been pressure to, ensure that this is not an interminable deal. There was a 1-year kind of window on this. So it's not as though Orbán got everything that he wanted out of this vaunted, relationship with Trump. And okay, does this mean that the Magyar government is going to have a bad relationship with Trump? Not necessarily. So obviously we know that Vance was busy sort of helping with the campaign in April, and Trump has called Orbán a true friend and a great leader. And he has a direct line to the White House. So it would seem with this new leader that Hungary risks losing this informal back channel access to the US government. However, Trump has already said very nice things about Magyar, calling him a good man, and that he expects him to do well. So I don't think there's going to be a big difference there. Of course, things matters on the matter of Ukraine. This might actually mark a kind of a disjuncture between the two countries. And then, of course, Magyar has expressed his strong support for NATO, reversing course on years of Hungarian blockage of military support. So in the area of migration policies, here you see the smallest change, and that's not surprising because this is an area of nationalism, which is kind of, links the TISA government with the Fidesz government, right? They're not that different in their brand of socially conservative nationalism. So we should basically, Magyar's on record saying the Orbán government has been too lax on immigration and refugee laws, and they want to keep taking a hard line on border protection, maintain the border fence, and oppose refugee quotas and the migration pact against EU wishes. So this is a kind of a red line for the government and tells you kind of about who they are. If they're not, these bleeding heart liberals, right? Which everyone knows. Okay, and then the final point that I wanted to make speaks to the regional relations, right? The diasporic regional relations, which of course are mixed because you have Hungarian minorities in 6 neighboring countries. 7, 6. So this is really a wild card here because, the question of regional relations that cut both ways. On the one hand, the new government is committed to disrupting the Orbán network of diaspora support. This means the government is likely to take a more hands-off approach toward Hungarian minorities abroad, and that is likely to be helpful in improving relations with certain neighbor countries, particularly Romania, and making minority representation less problematic in these countries because they're seen as a Trojan horse for Budapest/Fidesz influence. At the same time, however, the Magyar government is likely to engage in more conflict with the Vučić government in Serbia, right? Because Vučić had a really close relationship with Orbán. Of course, there was this crazy incident prior to the elections of this explosion in Serbia that, the Orbán government was blaming on Ukraine, but meanwhile, the Magyar government was claiming this was a false flag by the Orbán government to help them in the elections. So this relationship is probably not going to be great. And there could be conflict with the Fico government in Slovakia, although they have signaled that they want to finally resolve the Beneš decrees conflict, which has been a long-standing issue. And then you also have Babiš in the Czech Republic, who had a good relationship with Orbán, unclear how he would approach Magyar. At the same time, obviously, relations between Hungary and Poland are likely to improve. So it's not necessarily telling us that there's going to be positive or kind of a cohesive, kind of pan-Visegrad type of relations any more now so than before. A lot of things are going to cut both ways. And it will be interesting. I have a personal interest because I, together with Beate Huska and Nassim Abiganem, have done a social network analysis of Betlen Gábor funding of diaspora organizations, minority schools, and every kind of parties in Slovakia and Romania, something that has grown massively under the Orbán government. Unclear what's going to happen with these networks now. I think that is going to be one factor in the relationships that the new Magyar government has with neighboring countries. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Erin, for bringing in the foreign policy and international dimension to this. You focused primarily on what to expect from the new Hungarian government regarding foreign policy and how their relationships will evolve, I should have said. But I'm also going to ask you to think about and maybe later reflect on how you think about what this election and the fall of the regime means for global Trumpism, which is something that I know you and I have talked about also organizing a panel on that at some point, maybe at the beginning of the fall term. And so there's very interesting implication and important implication of that as well. So I will ask you to address that. Before we go to that, however, there have been some great questions posted in the Q&A box, and I'd like to invite everyone to continue posting questions. One of them is, actually, there are 2 questions here that I'm going to combine and ask Zsolt Enyedi to take the first stab at this, which both of them have to do with the bigger question of how come Orbán has let this happen. So there was one question that is an interesting one about why was Orbán either unwilling or unable to, as this author of the question, Daniel Epstein, is asking, to go full Putin and install the kind of autocracy, dictatorship that moves away from what we call competitive authoritarianism, which allows for elections, to not allowing competitive elections and essentially just staying in power. And then there's another question, which also is asked by someone from this one is an anonymous attendee who is asking about what happened in the countryside, how that made a difference on April 12. And so I'm going to just leave it there and ask Zsolt to address that.
Yes. I think going full Putin was never in the cards, but it's true that Orbán could have made some further steps towards autocratization. And actually, he tried about a year ago. He tabled a law that would have posed a huge threat to independent media, civil society organizations, and so on. And there he basically had to withdraw it because there was not enough support even in his own party. And that was maybe the only case when some important members of the regime elite revolted against him, which shows that there are certain measures that are very difficult to introduce in an EU country. Some of the objection was actually not based on principle, but on technical considerations, like stopping any foreign money coming into Hungary and supporting civil society. That requires complex banking surveillance and cooperation with international banks, and it's just technically not so easy to do that. And also Fidesz is as networked internationally as the opposition. So there's a lot of money going out of Hungary to foreign countries, a lot of money coming into Fidesz's coffers from partners. So it was just technically very difficult to find a solution that could work. Of course, Orbán could have go full Vucic in the sense of using thugs to intimidate more civil society actors and opposition. And there I think Orbán made a choice not to do it. It was partly because of his own personality, partly because of the likely reaction from the international environment, and also because Fidesz got to power as a movement that was protesting against the political use of violence. Here I would even describe Orbán as a kind of very interesting type of sportsman, the kind who uses drugs and pays the referee to add 2 goals to the team, but not 3 goals. There is a limit how far he wanted to go. And in terms of the rural vote, it seems that local elites were tired of the regime because the regime was not able to finance them anymore, partly. And also, it seems that it is possible to reach remote local villages with the kind of campaign techniques used by Magyar. The most important group was, although we don't have data on this, the Roma. The Roma, because they are the most vulnerable, used to be target of voter intimidation and vote buying. And as I mentioned, it seemed that in this case, this happened to a much smaller extent than earlier, partly because of civil society activists were present on the ground and stopped any such attempt.
Thank you, Zsolt. There's a question from John Packer that I'm going to ask both Márta and Gábor to address aspects of it briefly. It's about whether one reason for the Hungarian experience, which was autocratization before there was this landslide victory of the opposition that wanted to get rid of the autocratic regime, whether that longer term experience is attributable to an immature democracy. He says that whether there is a thin liver depth that has to change in order for the kind of sustainability that both of you talked about, and what would you prioritize to achieve that? Márta, let's turn to you first. You were emphasizing the resilience of Hungarian society, something that had not been visible by many of us. Of course, it was visible to you and other practitioners who actually were there and knew those people and worked with those people. So I'm going to ask you first, and then Gábor also to address this a bit.
Thank you for this question, and I'm very interested in what Gábor will say. Most of our work related to rule of law and fundamental rights protection focuses on two issues: institutions and individuals. Or the members of society, rather. And I think when we talk about the quality of democracy in Hungary, I think we have to see how it took 16 years to get where we are, and 15 years until the proposed law that Zsolt talked about was introduced, which would have been really a shift, a very rapid change in the sort of hybrid regime. So institutions were eroded slowly in a very technical manner, gradually, and the judiciary was a focus of these attacks or attempts for many, many years. And we've always said that it was the last line of defense or the last battleground, because it was the capture of the judiciary was not complete. Still, at the same time, I think many Hungarians lost faith, for example, in these very important democratic institutions. This was clear from social surveys, and people were not disillusioned with, for example, the judiciary for the very typical or very frequent reasons that many European societies encounter, which normally is that it's inefficient, it's slow to actually get justice, but rather people felt that there is too much political pressure on the Hungarian judiciary. And so this was, I think, one aspect or one angle. And the other is whether Hungarians really were that, as a society, were we so strong in our democracy? And obviously, there is going to be, I think, a lot of tests now in the next period, but it's very clear that there came a point where the doing away, the erosion of personal autonomy, the fact that you're a responsible adult who can make decisions for yourself and you want the government to simply just get out of your private sphere, became a very, very strong feeling, particularly in some sociologists have described how there was a real shift in small to mid-sized towns among the local elites who had been, by and large, Fidesz supporters for a very long time and had not only seen their personal, economic situation decline because of the economic stagnation, but they simply had enough of being told what to do and think, to have their full individual autonomy taken away. And they, in their own way, now in this vote, they rebelled against this. So there was, I think, and this, would you characterize this as a democratic characteristic, a trait? I'd say yes. People did want autonomy. They perhaps tolerated a reduction of that in exchange for economic gain. But when this offer was not held up, the desire not to be pushed around was very strong. So yes, perhaps, in the 90s, there could have been more focus on certain program areas, not only on building strong institutions that, are checks and balances, but also on strong citizens and strong citizen engagement. And certainly this was eroded quite intentionally by Orbán's government, particularly in the schools and in education. But I think it was not successful in its pursuit of having obedient citizens who are just happy with the economic gain. And I think this is a phenomenon to be explored. People clearly value individual liberties in Hungary far more than sort of community solidarity aspects. And this is a question for the future, perhaps left leaning political projects that Gábor talked about, as they should have a space, but how successful they can be. But I think in terms of autonomy in communities and sort of checks on government, people feel quite strongly about that and have perhaps not been so vocal about it, but when it became too invasive, they voted in a way that was perhaps breaking with long-standing traditions.
Thank you. Gábor, we are curious about your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Just try to be brief here. So I interpreted the question as really like a broad question from the rise to the fall of Orbánism, which is of course a huge question, but I think many of us touched on the kind of the crisis of this Third Republic before Viktor Orbán, which was a very complex story, but I think the failure or the unraveling of the democratic social contract was a critical part of it. So that this insight, if I have one big takeaway from the collapse of this Third Republic, is that formal institutions themselves, they don't protect themselves on their own. So if you want to sustain democracy, you need to build those institutions on a solid foundation. And that involves organized civil society, but also inclusion along culture, economic, and political lines. And those three dimensions were breaking down. So I think this is what the question referred to as immature democracy. I'm not sure if I like that word. I would more use a kind of hollow formal democracy, where you had really beautiful formal institutions that are critically important. Constitutional court, all those things were there. But then Hungarians reached a point somewhere in the 2000s, the second part of 2000s, that they were asking, if these liberal institutions and elites don't care about me, why should I care about them? So that led Hungarians to buy into this authoritarian social contract that Viktor Orbán was saying that, we don't need all this thing. Let me just fix all of this for you. And then he was lucky because there was this upward cycle of the Eastern European economy, a lot of German capital relocating to Eastern Europe after 2012 to gain competitiveness. So that boosted Eastern Europe and including Hungary. And that helped Orbán to get away with his democratic backsliding. But as soon as wages started to stagnate from 2020, and you had these waves of crises, COVID, you shouldn't forget that healthcare defunding led Hungary suffering the third highest per capita death rate during the COVID crisis. Inflation highest in Europe. Inequality skyrocketing. You're seeing these cronies stealing and yachts and sex scandals and whatever, and then you go to a hospital and then you don't find the toilet paper. That's also a moral crisis as well. So this is when the authoritarian social contract started to break down. And to get from there again to a kind of a sustainable democratic social contract, again, I would just highlight that we need the institutions. And there I have high hopes for Peter Magyar to make really significant improvements. But then it's an open question whether these longer term foundations will be there, the inclusion around these lines that we're discussing, economic and security, political voicelessness, and also civil society. If I may just say one word about that is, I think you can divide it up in two dimensions, whether it is organized and spontaneous. And we had beautiful spontaneous outpouring of social energy before and after the election, really heartwarming to see, even from abroad. Uh, Yet I would say the organized part is more the kind of the professional organization, which is extremely vital. The watchdog, the journalism, that part. But the mass pressure organizations are the weaker ones, and you need both. You need the information, the advocacy, the high quality professional advocacy, but you also need the kind of the consumer groups, the labor groups, even faith-based groups in many countries were critical for stabilizing democracy from the bottom up. Big lessons from Egypt, Tunisia is the buy-in from labor unions, right? So that's a critical part that we'll have to see in the long run when talking about inclusive foundations, the solid foundations of democracy that we'll have to build to make this sustainable.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Erin back and turn to the question of how people living in authoritarian countries or in countries where there are leaders who are would-be autocrats, what can this Hungarian example tell them? And I also would like to just put in parentheses that I think one of the big questions and a big tension and dilemma that's been touched upon here is that we are at a time when we see the significance, the importance of strengthening institutions, but at the time when institutions have not been working for people, which is why there is such a strong anti-establishment sentiment that brings populists to power, because there are good reasons, legitimate reasons why people are disappointed in institutions, in the redistributive institutions or lack thereof that Gábor has emphasized, and other institutions, right? So the TISA movement is a populist and was a populist anti-establishment movement as well. But at the same time, you're talking about the need for the democratic, the normative, the institutions domestically and down to the local municipal level, and also the nested institutions. So how can we deal? So it's now up to you, Erin, to give us the answer to to
That's
this
the easiest one for last, right?
Yeah, of course.
Great. Okay. Oh, well, there's a lot to unpack there. I think the first question that you were hinting at earlier was about what this is going to mean for international Trumpism, something like that. I think my answer to that, as well as your broader question about what we can learn from, let's say, this experience, or what maybe other autocrats or would-be autocrats are learning from this experience, is that liberal nationalism is, and by liberal nationalism, I mean small L liberalism, right? The Kantian liberalism, the David Miller liberalism, right? The Yale Tamir liberalism, which basically says we need to build up an inclusive type of, what's often called patriotic or civic nationalism, right? And underneath this is this kind of impulse to bind all types of different people together, all types of different kind of, faith traditions, communities under this rubric of, this unifying national identity, which also is open to the world, right? So this is basically a kind of like a mirror opposite of this kind of populist nationalism, this kind of MAGA sort of pro-sovereignty approach, which is very small, very kind of exclusionary nationalism. Often it's been sort of, characterized as organic nationalism, the very kind of ethnic nationalism. This is the kind of Orbánian Hungarian nationalism, right? That is less inclusionary, that's more sort of based on kind of like majority national identity, right? And that also tends to be more closed to the world and more kind of combative to these kind of like liberal organizations that threaten to shine a spotlight into, the inner workings of the government, right? Which obviously they want to avoid at all costs. So, that I think is probably the most hopeful thing from the point of view of, let's say, liberal Democrats when they look at this, is that this is something that we can use to forge a wide coalition with, to kind of appeal to and forge a broad based movement, such as what we saw with the TISA election campaign, right? So but and this is where the pessimist in me kind of pops up again, and it relates to your question earlier about what does this mean for international Trumpism. I don't think I'm long on populism. I don't think populism is going to go anywhere. I think these guys are always popping back up. Look at Fico, look at Babiš, right? There are tons of different examples, right, of, Trump himself, right? These guys that you think are gone and then they pop back up. And let's face it, what is, MAGA, but actually a sort of a reboot of the Tea Party movement, right? So you have this kind of long push, this like, kind of like brewing dissatisfaction that all of you guys have mentioned that people have with the liberal democratic model, that it's not, representative, it's not yielding, it's, what's on the tin, it's not yielding all of these benefits, right? There were a lot of disappointment with EU accession, that this is going to bring prosperity. Didn't really bring prosperity for a lot of people. So then people are dissatisfied, right? And I think we're just going to continue seeing this burbling up all over the place, popping up in some places and later popping up in others, where you have competing mass movements that are fighting over the soul of the nation.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the clock, and it's exactly 2:30 EST, but at the same time, for all of our panelists, as well as myself, this is evening in Central Europe, or even more to the east from that. So I'd like to just say that this was fascinating, and thank you to all our panelists and also to all our attendees for participating, for being here with us. And I hope that you will continue to follow us. And I hope that you're also aware of the ASN's convention that is coming up at Columbia University in just over a week, May 26th to 28th. And so I hope I will see many of you there. And there's also an ASN European conference in Belgrade in September. And virtual ASN will be here continuously to connect us and to offer possibilities for discussing bigger questions about nationalism, also questions about major events like this Hungarian election. And I hope to see you back. Thank you, and good night to everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.